Hey everybody, welcome back to another campfire with me, Dante Rinaldi, and Stage 3 VFX. This one's a lot of fun because the challenge we had was to generate 5,000 unique and random animated movies under a very tight time frame. And this had to do with a project with Chris Jericho. If you don't know Chris Jericho, he's a famous wrestler and a musician. And he invented a character called the PainMaker. And the PainMaker is now a graphic novel, an animated graphic novel. And the first issue is written by Chris Jericho, as well as the very talented individuals David Shapiro, and illustrated by John Gardner. Now, how do we create some promotions that have true uniqueness, true randomness, and do this where we're not actually swamped with work for days and months on end? The two main challenges to get this done, and we're going to do this over a series of 2 campfires. Number one, how do we get something unique in each movie without some time-intensive 3D rendering, but still have this new element that's put into these movies have the same reaction to the lighting inside the environment and respond to that lighting? How do we do that fairly easily and quickly? And secondly, how are we going to actually queue up and keep track of 5,000 unique variations of this animated promotion without accidental repeats? Or even better, how can we just fire this off with one click, go to bed, come back the next morning, and we're done? The two elements to solve this was, number one, we're going to work with STMaps. And if you haven't worked or don't know what STMaps are, then this campfire is for you. And the second thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a really simple Python tool in our compositing program, Nuke, to get all of this done all at once and basically make the computer do all the hard work. So let's take a look at the project at hand here. It's the first issue of Chris Jericho's PainMaker by Semcor Comics. And we got a cool cover here, art by John Gardner, as I said. And you can flip through, and it's an animated graphic novel because you could see you could click on different things and you get animations, things of that nature. But what they wanted to do was have another 3D animation that kind of went into the world a little bit more as a promotion. And so right off the bat, we thought, well, why don't we actually just take a look at the very first page here? It has this lab over here where all kinds of exciting and fun things are about to occur and kick off the storyline. So we took this 3D lab idea right here, and I'm going to zoom in, and as you can see, there's a little bit of a 2D animation in there, but we convert this to 3D, and we're going to have a little fun by kind of going through the room. And before we get any further, let's actually just take a look at quickly the end result, and then we could break down how we did this. So the 3D lab that we built, pretty simple, a lot of modeling in Maya. We took it and applied the Arnold toon shader so it would still retain that look of a graphic novel, heavy outlines, that kind of thing. And as you could see at the very end of each 3-shot sequence, we have a cover variation. 250 different variations of these comic book covers to put into this thing. Here's the scene in Maya. I'll get to a little bit more of this later when we talk about cameras and what we put into this. The far rooms right over here, pretty basic. I knew they were going to be mostly in shadow, so I didn't spend a whole lot of time on those far rooms, but it was a lot of fun kind of bringing that illustration here to life of the laser scene. And of course, you'll notice, you spin the camera around and there's nothing going on the other side of the camera because naturally, never build what the camera's not going to see. As far as the smoke effects and that kind of a thing, that was just generated in passes in EmberGen, which is a fantastic program, but EmberGen is a lot of fun. So this is the scene that we'll get back to a little bit later in Maya, but just wanted to show you this, as well as show you what the raw renders look like and what we did in Nuke to give it the final look. Then we'll get to the bulk of this campfire, which is STMaps. Real fast, just to complete the workflow, took the Maya renders, we threw it into Nuke, and as you can see, this is the raw render, which a lot of people think, as soon as I'm done rendering, pretty much done with the work, with the shop. Now, of course, that's not true at all. I would say rendering is about 60% of the way there. Compositing, that's where the magic actually happens. And of course, we have a course in compositing that you could explore a little bit later on the website. But this is the raw render coming out of Maya in the Toon shader, broken down into multi-channel EXRs. Here's the diffuse and some spec passes. I always like to render spec passes separate, as well as emission passes. And we can go through some of this stuff a little bit later if anybody's interested. The Ember Gen passes actually started out with a completely different color, putting those together, giving it kind of a sci-fi kind of a look. Towards the end of the comic book kind of feel, we have these little spacey things that kind of happen. Additional spec passes for the laser light that was happening. When I'm doing spec passes, and we can talk about this at another campfire, I like to render out specialized lights in completely different passes, so I have a lot of control over all of the lighting once it's putting in there. And then, of course, great smoke. Smoke, not great smoke, but great as in these grates that are emitting smoke up there. And then just kind of bringing them all down into the final pass with a couple of fade in and fade outs. And that's basically the comping pass. More on that a little bit later. Let's get to the bulk of what we're talking about here, and that is the STMap. What we do on every one of these shots is the camera is going to end up looking at a variation of the comic book covers that I showed you earlier, the ones that John had drawn up. Every one of these has a certain pass on these blanks right now. As you can see right now, there's no comic book right there, but it'll be filled in with an STMap later in post to speed us up. So we're not having to sit here and render out 5,000 versions of a different comic book cover where this black box would actually be. But let's explain what STMaps are and how we utilize them in Maya and how we can play with them in Nuke as well. So here I am in Maya, and what I like to do is usually set it up as a separate render pass. So I'm just going to create a simple plane, zoom in on it, and we can shrink down our subdivisions. We don't need it quite so high. And maybe I'll just make this a little bit bigger. Okay, and the first thing we should do is, you could assign STMaps as a separate pass to cover everything in your scene and work with that in post. Or if you're like me, you just want to kick it out as a multi-channel EXR. And why don't we do that right now? So I'm just going to jump up here to my render globals, and I'll show you where actually to access the shader, because it can be a little bit hidden for people. Okay, so I'm in the Arnold shader right here. I'm going to jump over to AOVs, and you're not going to see STMaps in here anywhere. So we're going to add it as a custom. So I'm going to click Add Custom, and let's just call this STMap, something like that. And it automatically puts you inside the attribute editor for that shader right away. If you happen to click off of that, just jump right over here to STMap, the down arrow, and choose Select AOV Node to jump back in. We have to assign this pass a shader. So let's just go over to Custom AOV, Shader, click on the little checkerboard. And what we're going to do is we're going to go down to the Arnold section here. And you're going to see something without typing anything in. You're going to see all these elements in here, and you're not going to find anything called UV pass or STMap pass or anything like that. But what you are going to find is what's called an AI utility shader, and that's what we're looking for here. So if you just type in AI capital U, you'll see AI utility listed right there. And so the ST pass is basically a subset of the AI utility shader. So I'm just going to select that, and there's a couple of things we need to adjust for right here, and then we're going to demo what this actually is doing for us. In the shade mode, we're going to set it to flat, basically rendering out texture coordinates. Okay, we don't want it to have any lighting or any kind of shading, anything like that. So it's completely flat. And then in the color mode, let's just go down and set it to UV coordinates. And this is a very interesting note here, because an STMap is really nothing more than a UV map that's rendered out to all the geometry in the actual laying out of the UV coordinates themselves, okay? And I'll show you what I mean by that. So let's just set that to UV coordinates, and you should get this funny orangish yellow kind of sphere there, and that'll tell you that you did it correctly, right? Now, we didn't assign anything as a texture to this object here. It just has the same old, Lambert texture, but it's now going to be a render pass that we could create later when we write out our multi-channel EXR, okay? So right over here, let's just fire off our IPR. And you'll see, obviously, we don't see anything. So let's actually just add a quick light. I'm just going to go Arnold. And all we really need is a sky dome light. Let's turn that on. And I like to take the camera visibility, turn that to 0 so we don't see anything in there. And it just has our Lambert shader. But if we switch our pass over here, our render pass to STMap, there we go. We're going to start seeing things, okay? Now, one thing we are going to see also, of course, is the UV coordinates of the sphere itself. And, you know, that's the light sphere. So turn off visibility right there, then we're not going to get any kind of background as in that whole area dome light back there, okay? So what are we looking at here real quick? Let's get rid of our global renders. Well, what we're looking for is basically a combination of the UV coordinates that are going from 0, 1, so 0 to 1 up here, and the 0, 1 to space down here in the U and the V directions, okay? And why are they all these funny colors? Well, really, it's just 2 colors, and it's the combination of the 2 colors that make up that third color, yellow. So let me show you what I mean by that. I'm just going to jump into our UV editor just to show you what this actually looks like. If I take my whole UVs and I shrink them all down very, very skinny like this, and put this right on the edge of the left-hand side of our UVs, basically you're seeing green go from dark to light, okay? And so the value of green, the intensity of that green as a numerical value from 0 to 1 is the amount of UV coverage you're getting right there as far as texture, okay? So it's just green, and then if we go the other way and I shrink this down very, very skinny, but this full length of our UV pass and put it near the bottom here, guess what? You're going to see dark red to full red, okay? So it's just green in this direction, red in this direction, and then, of course, the combination of the 2 colors added together, and if I put this right up here in the 1-0 space right up here, so they're both 100% 1, put them together, it equals yellow. So that's why you're getting all those funny colors. But those funny colors are mathematical channels that is telling the post product that you're going to use, whether it's After Effects or Nuke, where to actually align that texture. And just to show you what I mean by that, I'm going to close out the UV editor, and let's close this out as well. And we have our object here, and we didn't destroy construction history or anything. It's still a polyplane that I could actually change the width and the height, right? Let's actually take this comic book page from the issue that we're talking about and throw it on that so we could actually see what it looks like. Now, there's 2 ways to go about doing this. What some people like to do, looking at this image, if you wanted to put this into Maya as a texture, is they shrink the whole image down to make it a square. They distort it so it fits perfectly into the UV perfect square of your coordinate system. I do not like that approach because you're hurting pixels. Anything you do as any kind of transformative element to any pixel, you're damaging it. You're always destroying pixels. So let's just keep this exactly like it is and just change our geospace to what we want this to be. And if I just look at this image inside of the Explorer window, we could see that it's 1349 by 2048, right? So all you really have to do is you could just change the shape of your little plane here to match the exact same dimensions of your image. Now, if I made a plane that was 1300 by 2000, you know, why it's going to be huge. So maybe I'll just put a decimal in here. Maybe I'll just make it 13.49 by 20.48, and it'll be the same exact aspect ratio, right? So if I go right over here to the width, I'm going to change this to 13.49. And I'm going to change the height to 20.48, which exactly matches the dimensions of the comic book page, right? And if I jump right over here to my UV editor, you'll see I've already screwed up my UVs just playing around with it quite a bit. Now, I could rearrange this and stretch it out. Well, let's just do that real quick. I'm just going to grab my UVs, hold down X, and I'm just going to snap it to the grid so it fills up my UV space all over again. So there we go, something just like that. Okay, 0 to 1, everybody's happy. Close that out. Quickly go over here and make a new material. We could stick with just a standard AI shader. Jump right over here to the color. Go right over here, grab a file. Surf on over to where we're actually storing this. Here it is right here. Say OK. And then actually jump over here to turn on the textures so we could see, there we go, what it looks like. Now, this looks like it's backwards. Not a big deal. I'm going to jump right over here to my UV coordinate system and just jump over here to UVs, and I could just go transform, and let's just flip this the other direction, and we have it going in the right way. Of course, you could also see that your UVs are screwed up or not screwed up if you just go over to the shaded view. And if it's blue, you're in good shape. If it's red, you have a flipped normal there, okay? So there we go. There's our image looking good. Now, like I said before, the advantage to these STMaps is this could be any shape. I could have it bend. I could do whatever I want. In fact, let's just throw a quick bend on top of this. And of course, you're going to get a perfect UV space no matter where you render this in post. You can now throw any texture onto any one of these geometry elements here, and it's always going to line up exactly. So why are we doing it this way? Because we want to be able to swap many, many comic book covers in our animation with the STMap pass instead of having to render that out in our 3D program, which is going to take infinitely longer because it has to calculate lights and all kinds of stuff like that. So in this very last part, I just want to touch briefly on how we put this together in Nuke really quickly. And as you can see, here is the end result with the comic book coming up. And you may notice that the comic book is basically a perfect square. That could basically be just tracked in if you had to, but I want to show you another example utilizing maybe some Harry Potter Daily Prophet magazines here as well to show you that the advantage here, you know, obviously you could just track something in with corner pinning if something is straight, but if something is perhaps curved like this, the advantage is really clear. And I want to show you an additional trick where you can maintain and keep your lighting of the original scene in place with the highlights and the shadowing going on. You could see that the original comic book I just rendered out as a separate pass, and it's basically just 100% white as a matte, really, and then applying a constant to this to make sure that I turned all the channels, the RGB channels, to black, but maintained the alpha channel. I eroded the alpha channel. And what you can also do, if you actually take a look at your UVs here, and here is the STMap right here. And if for some reason you're looking at it and maybe you're looking at the green and the green is a little too high or too low compared to the number 1 that you're trying to achieve, because that would line it right up with the end of the UVs, you could always go back and change these and actually grade these a little bit. This grade right here is only grading the green channel. And if we just zoom in on where it is with or without it, without that grade, we're looking at 1.9. So it's quite a bit higher than that UV 1.0, but I just grade that and it's just simple numbers, and that'll bring it back down to what you're looking for, something closer. So if your UVs are still a little bit off, you can always change it in post. It's not a big deal. And so just taking a quick look at the final, there it is there, and then added back into the comp. But one thing I want to show you really quickly with some couple of tricks, and I'll show you this STMap node here, how that works as well, is say you had an image with a lot of curvature. This is where the real advantage of STMaps come into play, because like I said, a simple plane or a rectangle, well, you could just track that in. But with the curvature, you're going to have a lot more trouble, especially if it's animated and moving around. And perhaps the director said, hey, I want this issue of the Daily Prophet to be on this really simple curved geometry. But you also want to maintain the lighting, right? And I made it curve with only one area light, so we get this highlight here. Obviously, a newspaper is not going to have that strong highlight, but we're just playing around. And you want this shadowing to maintain as well. So what do we do very quickly just to get that look? You would just add an STMap node. Here it is here. And I'm just going to add another one right here. And let's just change this over to 1 for clarity. And the STMap here is going to be the read node with the multi-channel that you have for STMap or UVs or whatever you called it. That's in the STMap element right here. The source here is going to be the new texture or image you want to place on top of that geometry and have it distorted correctly, okay? So right up here in our original render, here's the beauty pass, the RGBA, and I want to tell you specifically why I colored it this gray color a little bit later. But the alpha channel, it's very simple. It's just a floor plane and the geometry. Here's our STMap. The STMap multi-channel pass is just going to apply itself to everything. That's okay because you can filter that out with a simple matte. And I just put a simple matte in Maya to say, hey, I'm going to probably need a matte on this geometry, especially if when there's motion blur and other things like that. And you never want to roto a CG render. That's always the worst thing to do. So going back to the beauty pass, I add the STMap in right here. Now, as you can see, just this image with this geometry with the STMap and it applies that texture everywhere you need it to go. You can see the UVs on the ground plane I didn't even play around with. I'm not going to need it. I'm going to strip that out. But there's a UV space that's just wrapping it perfectly around this piece of geometry. Right over here, all I actually did is I just shuffled out, for the sake of clarity, the alpha channel here. Right here, I just changed this matte to all the other things so we can add this back in. And then all I did is I took this new matte and I multiplied it against this image here, just so it strips out the background and the ground plane, because you don't want that anyway. So now you're looking at this and you're like, okay, well, I have my image properly distorted and it's isolated from the background, and I don't have an alpha channel, but if I just, for this, again, for the sake of clarity, I can shuffle this alpha channel right back in. So now I have an alpha channel, and if I go back and put this right over the original render, just like that, well, it doesn't look so good, right? I mean, yes, it's in the right environment, but a simple A over B is going to look like something that's slapped on, and it's not actually taking into account the lighting that was in the scene. It just looks like a big decal kind of slapped on, which doesn't look good at all. And so I knew that was going to happen. So what I actually did in the original render, and this is a little trick that you can keep in the back of your mind if you want to make sure your blending modes work for you, is I took this actual element here in Maya and I made this texture here exactly 50% gray. Now, why did I do that? Because in a blending mode like overlay, the overlay blending mode will actually take into account anything that is 50% gray. It will basically use the source image. If it's darker or lighter, it will modify that using an add or a multiply at the same time, which is kind of nice. That's exactly what we want, because we want to add the source image back on top of the Harry Potter element to get the highlight, and we want to multiply that shadow against the darker parts. So going over here, just changing my blending mode simply from an over to an overlay with the 50% gray texture I have already applied to it in Maya, and now we are getting the accurate highlight and the shadowing that we need, and we can simply throw that right on top of our background render again, and we're great. So we don't have to worry about how to comp that in again, worry about the lighting. The lighting's perfect because we're simply using a 50% gray on that source. If it wasn't a 50% gray, it's going to get screwy. You could just look at the math itself in Nuke, and it'll tell you exactly what the overlay is doing. It's a multiply if B is less than exactly 50% gray, or it's a screen if B is more than 50% gray. So it's like an add and a multiply at the same time, which is cool. And then of course the whole advantage to this is that you can swap this out in post, because invariably the boss, the art director, the director comes over and says, hey, this looks great, but we actually changed the issue here. It wasn't going to be The Boy Who Lies. We want it to be Death Eater Terror Continues, and you don't have to worry about re-rendering everything. You could just say, oh, okay, I'll just switch my source over to the new one, and you're exactly good to go, and nobody is the wiser. Right? And that's what we did with swapping out tons and tons and tons, 200-300 comic book covers with the animation that we had over here, because boy, would that be a nightmare to render out 5,000 of those. So now, how do we actually render these out in Nuke very, very quickly with one button? We're going to build that tool in Nuke in the next campfire. See you then.